Okay, Energy Media readers, today we're going to be talking about oil sands tailings pond, and has become a hot topic on social media thanks to the Alberta Energy War Room, aka the Canadian Energy Centre, and a ham-fisted promo piece for tailings ponds that they put out in the last day or two. And so I'd like to welcome to the interview Nina Lothian, who's the Fossil Fuels Director at Pembina Institute. So welcome to the interview, Nina.
Thanks, Markham.
Now, what I would like to get across to our readers in this interview is this sheer magnitude and scale of the challenge of remediating 37 tailings ponds that contain 1.3 trillion liters of toxics, water and sludge and whatever else is in there. How big a problem is it?
I think this is an enormous problem that has actually only grown. We found some documentation back from the 1970s where the Alberta government recognized that the biggest environmental challenge at that time associated with oil sands mining was dealing with the tailings. Now here we are, sort of almost 40 years later, and more than 40 years later, and it's still a challenge. And we actually have seen the volume in the tailings ponds continue to grow. Significant money and effort has been invested in trying to find solutions. And yet we see the projection into the future is not downwards, which is what we would all like to see. We'd like to see this significant liability on the landscape decreasing and having the confidence that the industry is able to clean it up.
And it's that confidence, I think, that there's a disconnect between the public, what the public feels and what the industry thinks, because the industry seems to downplay this issue all the time. We've got it under control. We've got all these new technologies that are coming on board. And I don't think when I talk to experts, they do not have the same confidence that industry has got a handle on this. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to downplay the effort that industry has invested. You know, billions of dollars have been spent on things such as centrifugation and Suncor's tailings reduction operations, et cetera, et cetera. So there has been a ton of really smart people trying to figure out this problem, but we actually have a history of, I wouldn't say failure, but disappointing results. So we had Directive 74 came out in 2009. Industry was fairly confident at that point that they could treat 50% of the fines, and in other words, treat essentially the fines, the tailings that were produced on an annual basis, keep up with it. That did not happen. Companies were never able to meet Directive 74 regulations. So they were in a sense scrapped, and we came out with Directive 85 in 2017. And now this is much more of a industry sets their own ambition, but there's still a lack of clear evidence that we've got tailings treatment figured out. There continues to be there was an emphasis on treating tailings to create terrestrial landscapes. That was kind of the direction Directive 74 was going, and the direction we'd like to go with Directive 85. But now we're talking a lot about water-capped tailings.
Let's talk about water capping, because a couple of years ago, I interviewed a professor of engineering at the University of Alberta, whose name escapes me right at the moment, doesn't matter. His argument was that if all we're doing is water capping the tailings ponds, which means basically putting water over top, a certain depth of water over top of the tailings, that is probably unacceptable. If, on the other hand, water capping means creating a viable marine ecosystem that can over time filter out all the toxic toxins and materials and so on that are in the tailings, then that might be acceptable. Have I kind of got a handle on the issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is acceptable, anyway, caveat that, would be end of pit lakes that are viable, i.e. they can be integrated into the natural environment, they can have inflows and outflows, they support aquatic life, they are not damaging to, the flora and fauna that may encounter them once handed back to Albertans, once the companies walked away. We're not sure we're on that path. We don't have the evidence that is possible. Obviously, continued research is happening, and maybe it could be possible at the end of the day. But the caveat is, can we accept a lakes district in the lower Athabasca where there never was that many lakes previously? So we've got every mining operator up there proposing to place fluid tailings in these spine note pits and capping them with water. And so I think, there's 9 operations. I think 7 of them have end of pit lakes with fluid tailings in them. So you're looking at 7 to 10 of these lakes on the landscape where there never were before. So there's a question of, are they viable? And also, is that the sort of landscape that is acceptable in that region in perpetuity? Because that's what we're talking about here.
This will be my last question for you, and it might be, so we're going to stretch you a little bit. So,
okay.
Let's assume that they put you in charge of tailings ponds at the Alberta Energy Regulator, or you're the energy or environment minister, but you have some authority here to fix this problem. And and you have the resources, the financial resources to do it. What do you do?
You're not going to love this answer, but I think the first question is information. I feel right now that there is a case of the regulator and the government not knowing the line that can be drawn with industry when it comes to tailings treatment. And what this comes down to is the financial implications of treating tailings. So industry has this information. They understand the costs associated with all these different technologies, including water capping. And they're obviously leaning towards water capping. So there's a financial, a factor at play with the direction they're headed. And so government doesn't have that information. And so government is very scared of putting these companies out of business. So I think there's an importance for the regulator and our government to understand the cost implications of these different technologies, and then regulate accordingly so that we actually do ensure, so we need to enforce treatment at a much more progressive rate, while balancing the fact that we don't want to put companies out of business. So we need to find that fine line of what is economically viable, while also making sure that we're not kicking cans down the road and just avoiding costs.
Isn't it rather extraordinary that almost, well, 50, let's say 50 years after these tailings ponds started to be developed, that government doesn't have enough information to adequately regulate remediation of these tailing ponds? I find that extraordinary.
Yeah, I think it's there's a power imbalance here. I think there's other jurisdictions that I've heard about that are much more transparent with this information, particularly when it comes to environmental issues. I think it's important that everyone has the information to make the best decisions, both in the interests of Albertans, but also in the interest of the industry, right? We need to find that fine line.
Sure, fair enough. So let's assume then that you wave your magic wand as energy minister and you now have enough information to make decisions. What strategy would you choose to make sure that these tailings ponds get remediated? Or can you even do that without the information?
Well, I mean, assuming I'm waving my magic wand and I have the information, then I think it's setting much more stringent outcomes. And so this might be getting too in the weeds, but the current regulation is pretty fuzzy in terms of what do we all agree is the desired outcome of tailings treatment. And so I think we need to be much more specific that it's treating the tailings to create a terrestrial landscape that we can then, reintegrate back into the natural environment and walk away from without perpetual maintenance. And so we need to see action on that path in the short term. And right now, the way the regulation is written, it's quite vague about what that final outcome really is. There's some flexibility on that final outcome, and there's flexibility on timelines. on achieving that final outcome.
I promise this will be the final question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my take on this, after again interviewing a number of experts on it, is that over the decades, really, government and industry operated on the assumption that, look, we're going to, even in 2020, this industry is going to be around for another 50 years. We have time. We'll be able to remediate it. We have the luxury of time. But I think now with the energy transition beginning to accelerate, we're talking about peak oil demand in maybe the late 2020s or mid 2030s. We don't maybe have that time anymore. And there is now the specter of stranded tailings ponds, that then become a public responsibility of the public, whether it's the provincial government or federal government. That's got to be a little frightening.
Yeah, no, I think it's a significant risk. I think how we manage liabilities in this province, from oil and gas, wells to the oil sands, needs to be revised, and more enforcement now needs to happen. And it's tricky because at $100 a barrel, that would have been the time to say, okay, guys, let's spend the money and fix this problem. And we're no longer at that $100+ a barrel, and so it's harder. But there's definitely this looming, what does the future hold? And if we don't deal with this now, it's just going to continue to grow. So, we need to take action.
Well, I'll conclude with Energy Media's editorial position on this, which is that we support the growth of the oil sands as long as carbon intensity is dropping as significantly. Absolute emissions are the growth is arrested at some point, and we begin to see a drop in absolute emissions, and the companies and the industry essentially improve their environmental performance. And I think maybe if we're talking environmental performance, the tailings ponds are emerging as the top environmental issue that needs to be, where performance needs to be accelerated, and we need to see some progress.
Absolutely.
Anyway. Thank you very much for this, Nina. We really appreciate it, and I have no doubt that we'll be talking to you again in the near future about this topic.
Great. Thanks so much for your time. Bye-bye.